Tanse, Oki, Bonjour, and hello. My name is Chanyang. I am Cree, Anishinaabe, and Métis from Mosque Cree Nation in Saskatchewan, which is in Treaty 6 territory. But today, I would like to welcome you to where we are broadcasting from, Treaty 7 territory. This land is known as Mohkitstis, which means elbow in Blackfoot. It is where everyone would come together, where the Bow River and the Elbow River meet. It was a confluence to bring everyone to share their stories, their songs, their ceremonies, to learn from each other, to grow together, and to build community in a meaningful way. And this is why it's so important to open any event by acknowledging the land upon which we stand. Because if you don't know where you are, how do you know where you're going? This is the home of the Treaty 7 people, the Blackfoot of Siksika, Gainai, and Pagani, the Sarsi Dane from Tsutsuna, and the Stony Nakota from Morley, which include Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Wesley First Nations. We're also walking in the footsteps of Métis Region 3, which is why I proudly wear my Métis sash, to act as that bridge between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. When we acknowledge the land, we're actually acknowledging far more than that. We're acknowledging the families that have been here for thousands upon thousands of generations, the stories that are steeped into this land, and those sites that we still do ceremony. They're over 15,000 years old, scientifically proven. And so when we acknowledge the land, we acknowledge our responsibility to honor those stories and to leave a better world for our future generations, and the relationship that we have not only to each other, but to the land itself. To welcome everyone into the circle, I'd like to share the Cree welcome song. Traditionally, when we sing songs, we sing in rounds of 4 to honor the 4 directions of the medicine wheel. But this song is a little different. We actually sing it in rounds of 3, and that's to keep the circle open and welcoming so everyone completes the circle today. Because in a circle, we're all connected. There's no beginning, there's no end, no one is greater or less than anyone else in the circle, just like in the hoop of life. So it teaches us to honor each other for those differences. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to agree 100% of the time, but it's when we can come together, share our stories, and find those compromises that our community is truly resilient. Mia Sin, which is the Cree welcome song, is from the Nataha family from Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation, and I honor that family for keeping this song and the story alive. Mia Sin doesn't just mean welcome, it also means beautiful. Mia Sin, Mia Sin, ha semina, ha semina, he peta kote, ni wagomagan, hota, homa, kitaskino, miasen, miasen, hasemina, hasemina, hepeta kote, ni wagomagan, hota, homa, kitaskino, miasen, miasen, hasemina, hasemina, hepeta kote, ni wagomagan, hota, homa, kitaskino. Hi, and welcome to the circle today. I would like to introduce my wonderful co-host. This is Ginger Mullins, and Ginger Mullins is a wonderful mother of two. She has been storytelling for over 25 years, but she looks phenomenal. And she runs a business here in town called Gingerbread Way. So if you're ever interested in some incredible work that's happening with storytelling and with understanding, please look up Ginger Mullins. And now, Ginger, take it away.
Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Chantal. Canadian Storytelling Day began in 2012 as a way of celebrating and building a community of listeners and tellers. It is always heartening and inspiring to know that others are sharing stories, listening and telling at the same time in their own spaces. Now, this year's intent is the same, but the format is obviously different. Instead of meeting together in person, we are doing so online. Now, we know the power of stories to change over time, to adapt to different customs, to different geographies. A queen in one story becomes a czarina or a sultana in another. But this year, we are experiencing the power of storytelling itself to change through this online format. So, and even though you won't be able to see your friends and strangers around you listening at the same time, know that they are there. We are still together. Storytelling Alberta is grateful for the support so that we can host this concert tonight. We would like to thank the Storytellers of Canada, Contour du Canada, Canada Council for the Arts, Ontario Arts Council, and Alberta Foundation for the Arts. And if you would like to make a donation, you can do so through the Storytelling Alberta website at storytellingalberta.com/donate. You can also like us on whatever format you're watching this. So we appreciate likes and comments. And if you'd like to contact us directly, you can email storytellingalberta@gmail.com. Storytelling is a unique and universal avenue of personal and cultural expression. So it's very fitting that tonight's theme is Legends We Share. And we have an impressive array of storytellers to share their experiences with you over the next 75 to 90 minutes. You know, storytellers always go a little bit longer than they think they will. So tonight you're going to have the pleasure of listening to Madiha Mada and Maria Crooks, Cheryl Chanyang Grayas, and Doreen Vanderstoop. But first, we have our lovely co-host, Chanyang. Chantal is a Cree, Ojibwe, Métis singer, drummer, activist, storyteller, educator, workshop facilitator, social justice advocate, and activist. She has roots in Mosque Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. She is a single mother of two boys, and she recognizes sharing culture and building community is an integral part of building bridges of understanding and acceptance. Welcome, Chantal. Thank you for sharing your story with us.
The Thunderbird in Anishinaabe culture means many different things. It is kind of that force that pushes us forward, fate or destiny that then leads us on the right path. It's also that little voice that we have inside us, that intuition. That's our internal Thunderbird, and it is never, ever wrong. It's also the voices of our ancestors. We always think 7 generations behind. What are my ancestors doing to lead me in the right direction? And 7 generations forward, what am I doing to leave a legacy for my future generations? And it's also that reminder that, you know, we have a choice whether we want to be on the hard path or the easy path. Now, the Thunderbird will warn us if we're starting to go off the beaten path and onto a harder path. But oftentimes we ignore our intuition. We ignore those little symbols and those little things that the Thunderbird lays for us, those feathers along our path. And that's when we get into trouble. And the Thunderbird's always been trying to warn us of these things for so many years. Because the Thunderbird had a gift that it shared with us. At first, not willingly, but later on. It was a gift for all of us. So this is the Thunderbird story. Many, many, many moons ago, when we were just created, we are the two-leggeds. Wasakajak, who was a spirit who was supposed to teach us how to live on the land, he's a little lazy, and so he didn't really do his job. But he got all of the plants, the animals, to share and to teach us how to live in this world. And so for many, many years, we had lived on the land. But it got really, really cold one particular winter, and we started to freeze. And Wasakajak started to take pity on us and said, oh my gosh, I should go talk to Creator and see if there's a way to protect and save the two-leggeds, which is us. And so he went to Creator and he said, Creator, Creator, the weather has changed, it's cold, and the two-leggeds, they're starting to freeze, they're starting to die. We need to protect them, we need to take pity on them, Creator. And Creator said, you're correct, Wasakajak. So go and speak to the buffalo. The buffalo will give of itself to keep the two-leggeds alive. So Wasakajak went to the buffalo, and the buffalo said, I will give myself to the two-leggeds. I will teach them how to use my hide to stay warm like we do in the winter. And I will also teach them how to eat my beautiful body so that they can be sustained, because in the winter there are no plants for the two-leggeds to eat. Also, with our beautiful hides, they will be able to create homes, teepees, structures, so they could stay warm throughout the winter months. And Wasakajak took these teachings and honored the buffalo and introduced the buffalo to the two-leggeds to share with them. And it worked for a few years. But on the fourth winter, it was so bitterly cold. And no matter how many layers of hide they had on top of them and how insulated their teepees were, the two-leggeds were still freezing to death. And Wasakajak took pity on them again, because, of course, they were made in Creator's and Wasakajak's image. And Wasakajak went to Creator and said, Creator, Creator, the two-leggeds are dying. It is too cold. There has to be a way for us to take pity on them and save them. And Creator said, no, unfortunately, Wasakajak, there is nothing we can do. And Wasakajak thought for a moment and said, well, what about the Thunderbird? The Thunderbird holds fire. We should give the two-leggeds some fire, because then they'll be able to survive through the winter. And Creator shook her head and said, no, Wasakajak. Those two-leggeds, they'll be negligent with the fire. The fire can be so destructive and harmful. Wasakajak, we need to protect not only the two-leggeds, but everyone else. And Wasakajak said he understood, but made a plan. Wasakajak's plan was to sneak into the Thunderbird's lair and steal just a teeny tiny piece of the Thunderbird's fire for the two-leggeds. And so Wasakajak snuck into the Thunderbird's lair. He reached in and stole a tiny piece of fire. So proud of himself, he started to sneak back out, not paying attention, and he tripped and he dropped the fire on the ground. As it rolled, it caught a bunch of brush on fire and it started to spread down the side of the mountain into the forest. Wasakajak, oh my gosh, what had he done? He picked up that tiny piece of fire again and he swallowed it to hold it in his belly so he wouldn't drop it again. And he started to run. And, of course, the ruckus of the fire burning woke up the Thunderbird. The Thunderbird woke up and saw that her beautiful fire was spreading all over the brush, all over the mountains, throughout the forests. And she knew she had to do something, so she spread her wings. And as she flew, rain poured down over the beautiful fire and putting it out. And she started to chase Wasakajak because she watched as he was running away. And she knew that he had stolen fire. And then, as Wasakajak saw her behind him, he said, I must hide! So he started dodging in between trees, and he knew he had to shift into something, so he changed himself into a Puss, the rabbit. And as he hopped along, he saw a clearing, and Wasakajak saw that the Thunderbird knew exactly where he was. And so he asked trees and all of the plants and the animals, who will protect me? Who will protect me? And then the birch trees, who stood very strong and were clustered in a circle, said, Wasakajak will protect you. So Wasakajak jumped, as would Puss the rabbit, and he hid underneath a cluster of the birch trees. The birch trees stood strong and plain and white, and as the Thunderbird soared down, she knew that they were protecting Wasakajak. And so she was so angry, she started tearing at the trees and clawing at the trees, and her beautiful lightning claws, as they tore the flesh of the trees, created huge burn marks. And this is why the birch tree is it burned the way that it is. It also is one of the reasons that the birch will not catch fire like most other trees when struck by lightning. And finally, Wasakajak came out and said, Stop, Thunderbird, I am so sorry for stealing from you. But we must take pity on the two-leggeds or they won't be there anymore. They're all going to die. They're going to freeze. And then as the Thunderbird turned around and saw that last little bit of fire that she had forgotten to put out, she saw as the two-leggeds were huddling around it, shivering in the cold, and she took pity on them. And she said, Okay, Wasakajak, I will give them fire, but you must make sure that they take very good care of it. I will teach them how to honor it and respect it, but one day they will forget the teachings, and it will cause a lot of problems. Wasakajak swore that he would remind them over and over and over again how to take care of the fire, how to respect and honor it, but we all know that we haven't. Now that Thunderbird, she's still there to this day, and she does cause fires, but she reminds us that sometimes those forest fires are a way for our world to rebuild, to rejuvenate, and sometimes after the biggest destruction, the most beauty can grow. In our own lives, no matter how hard our journey can be, it is for a purpose, it is for a reason. It gives us strength, and the Thunderbird is that strength. Now, I will share the Thunderbirds Song. For a being that carries so much significance and so much meaning, it's a very short song.
Well, next I would like to welcome Madiha Mada. She was named Storytelling Alberta's Emerging Storyteller in 2019. She enjoys learning and telling family stories and historical stories and folk tales. She is passionate about community, culture, and anything related to identity. Madiha enjoys writing, connecting with others, and spending time outdoors in all kinds of weather, which is great if you've seen the weather outside tonight. She learns and plays alongside her 2 children and husband in Calgary, Alberta. And if you would like to learn more about her resources, you can send an email to storytellingalberta@gmail.com. And welcome, Madiha. Let me just unmute you here.
Thank you, Ginger, for that introduction. Assalamu alaikum. I begin with the traditional Muslim greeting, which means peace be upon you. The story that I'm telling tonight, Knowing One Another, is a story of the early Canadian Muslims and their interactions with those who were already here. Many people may not know that the first documented case of Muslims in Canada appeared in the 1854 census. Now that's even before the Confederation. In 1851, a Scottish couple named James and Agnes Love immigrated to Canada. And within a few years, they started having a family. And so the Muslim population started growing, very little by little at first. But I must point out that while they were the first documented case of Muslims, Muslims were in Canada even prior to that. Some of the Muslims that were taken as part of the transatlantic slave trade from Western Africa were indeed Muslim. And as they escaped or freed themselves through slavery and found their way to Canada, they settled here. A notable case is that of Richard Pierpoint. Now, some of the first Muslims that came were around the turn of the century for the Klondike Gold Rush. And among them, there was a man named Ali Abu Shadi, who was only 13 when he came to Canada. He had come with his uncle, and after a few years, his uncle had headed back to Lebanon, their native land. But Ali stayed, and he traveled westwards. There, he became a fur trapper, living amongst some of the indigenous from the area. And living with them and being friends with them, he picked up Cree. A few years into his business, another man, known as Abu Ali Gotmi, better known as Frank Courtney, also came. And he also lived with the indigenous and in that area. And he picked up not only Cree, but Dene as well as Ukrainian, French, Swedish, and of course, English. Perhaps one of the best known stories is that of the first mosque in Canada. And for those of you who are joining us from Edmonton tonight, you might already know this. One of the early fur traders that came, Ali Hamdan, he had gone back to Lebanon to get married. And he returned with a young wife named Hilwi. Now, Hilwi and Ali lived first in Fort Chipewyan. And there, they also were fur traders and conducted business. As their family started growing, Hilwi insisted that they move to Edmonton so that their children could attend school. When she got to Edmonton, she became a part of that community, and she lived alongside the others. And a few years later, when she was talking to some friends, she said, what if we built a mosque? Building a mosque in Canada was almost, or in North America, was almost unheard of at that time. In fact, there was only one, maybe two mosques in the whole continent, and they were in the United States. Hilwi brought her idea forward to the mayor of the time, John Fry, and he told her that he would give her the land if she could raise the money. Now, this was no easy task because these were the years of the Great Depression, but that didn't deter Hilwi. She went up and down Jasper Avenue, knocking on all the storefront doors, explaining her vision. And so with the help of the other shopkeepers and community members, who were mainly Jewish and Christian, she was able to raise enough money to build Canada's first mosque. And perhaps equally impressive is that on the grand opening of the mosque, the mayor of Edmonton was in attendance, along with the mayor of Hanna, who lived east of where Edmonton was. And he was actually a Christian Arab. And so he traveled that far to be part of this celebration. And for those of you who may be familiar with the Quran, one of the notable translators of the Quran into English, Yusuf Ali, was also traveling Canada through this time, and he was in attendance as well. Another notable early story was that of Peter Baker. He was originally called Abu Ali Ferran. And as he made his way through Canada, a priest that he met gave him another name, thinking that it might help him establish himself here. Now, Peter Baker lived in the Northwest Territories, and there he traded and became friends with the Dene, and he picked up some of those languages. As his career in fur trading came to an end, he decided to enter politics. And in 1964, he became the first Muslim to be part of the Canadian government. He worked at he was actually an MLA, and his election was notable for a few reasons. Not only was he the first Muslim, but he was elected in a riding whose constituents were, for the most part, Indigenous. And many of those people had never voted before, because prior to 1960, many of them didn't have the right to vote. So how impressive is it that with their first vote, they elected this man who served for one term before he retired. And he's also written a book about his life, a memoir called The Arctic Arab, which you might be able to find in some of the older bookstores. Now, as the time passed and policies began changing, Canada opened its borders to some Muslims that were brown and black-skinned. And here starts the story of my father. My father was born in 1953 in Pakistan. He was the oldest of 7. And when he finished his undergraduate education, he turned his eyes towards Canada. He applied as an international student, and in December of 1973, he said goodbye to his family and traveled here. Now, he was welcomed in a quintessentially Canadian way, with a snowstorm. And so the flight that he was on couldn't land in Toronto as planned because it was just too blizzard-like. So it had to land in Montreal, and he was given a train voucher to complete his journey. Now, in the beginning, it took him some time to become acquainted with life and settle into his new roles. You see, he was a full-time student in the day, and in the evenings, he often worked in restaurants. The biggest change was probably the lack of family and community. You see, in Pakistan, my father was surrounded by his extended family, and he grew up on the same street as his friends. But in Canada, he really didn't know many people. And so he was able to reach out and make friends with other people that were in a similar position, with other Pakistani Muslims at the time. And one of the first things that they did was look for a place to pray. Muslims traditionally gather at mosques. And luckily for him, just a few years earlier, there was a mosque that was built not too far from where he was staying at the time, Jami Mosque. And Jami Mosque is special for a number of reasons. If you look at a mosque, you will see typically they use domes in construction. There's geometric patterns and beautiful Arabic calligraphy. But Jami Mosque didn't look like this. It was tall and narrow with angled roofs. And that's because Jami Mosque was initially built as a Presbyterian church in 1906. The Muslim community had acquired it towards the end of the 1960s. And it was the main place of worship for many Muslims in Toronto at that time. It was also special for me because for the 20 plus years that my family lived in Toronto, that was the mosque we would go to. And I have fond memories of being a child on summer holidays. My father, who was home during the day, would take us with him on Friday afternoons. The sun would be shining and I would be skipping up the sidewalk because if you've ever been to a mosque on Friday, you'll know that it's very hard to find parking. So my father would park on the street and we would do that little walk. My brother and I had made a game out of seeing who could touch the most parking meters. We would reach out and try to touch them and turn the little knobs as we walked towards the mosque. And when we would get to the mosque, we would remove our shoes and my father would go into the main prayer hall with these high ceilings and beautifully tranquil green carpets. My brother and I, though, we would choose to pray elsewhere, away from my father's watchful gaze. We would often find a room that was full of other women and children, and we would marvel at all of the beautiful fabrics and the colors they wore. I didn't know it then, but it really helped me understand what Islam in Canada was about, as I saw faces that were black, brown, white, and all different shades in between. Another thing that came up for my father in those early days was where to find halal meat. Muslims traditionally eat meat that has been blessed and slaughtered in accordance to Islamic law. And at the time, there were no Muslim butchers or halal meat stores. But my father heard about a place called Kensington Market. Kensington Market was a place that has a very long and interesting history, often involving immigrants. In the 1910s and 20s, when thousands of Jews from Eastern Europe immigrated to Toronto, they settled there. And at the time, it was a community of townhouses. But what many of them did was set up shops. Initially, it started with setting tables outside of their homes where they would have goods for sale. And then they converted the bottom floors of those houses into actual shops. And so Kensington Market also was known as Jewish Market. As time passed, the Jewish community became more established and was able to afford to move elsewhere, leaving openings for other people that were coming to Canada. So it became populated with people from Hungary, Portugal, China and East Asia, and the Caribbean. But the one thing that really stood out about Kensington Market was the variety of goods you could find there. All sorts of specialty cheeses and breads, produce and meat housed under this one roof. And if you ask anyone from Toronto from that era, they'll tell you, live chickens. You see, my father, even though the majority of Jews had moved on, there were still some left in that market. And so my father found a kosher butcher who was willing to let his Muslim customers slaughter and bless their own chickens. So my father would go, pick out a chicken, do his prayer, slaughter that chicken, and hand it back to the butcher, who would then continue to pluck it, cut it up, and pass it back to my father. How wonderful is it that my father was able to follow a halal diet because of the help of this Jewish butcher. Now, these are all examples of the ways that this diversity has added to the richness of Canada, and how these ways of knowing one another have given us this fabric in this society. But what happens if we don't? What happens if we choose not to know one another? In the 12th century, there was a scholar, an Andalusian scholar by the name of Ibn Rushd, known better in the West as Averroes. And he said that ignorance leads to fear, and fear leads to hate, and hate leads to violence. We know all too well how that can play out. So what would happen if instead of looking at our differences as reasons for superiority and supremacy, we looked at our differences as an invitation? I want to close by sharing with you a verse from the Quran, which is a book that informs the way that I live my life. O mankind, we have created you from a male and a female into nations and tribes so that you may know one another. And isn't it fitting that we are gathered here tonight using storytelling to do just that? I want to say thank you to my fellow storytellers. I can't wait to hear your stories, and to the organizers of this event, and for Storytelling Alberta and Canadian Storytelling Day for giving us the opportunity to put this on. And of course, I would like to give my sincerest thanks to the listeners. Thank you for loaning us your ears and your hearts, and I hope that we may continue in this legacy of knowing one another.
Maria Crooks is a Calgary storyteller, playwright, actor, and singer. She is interested in myths, legends, and folk tales from Africa and the Caribbean. She has participated in storytelling events for audiences of all ages in English and French, and she is also fluent in Spanish. Several of her plays have been produced locally, and Maria believes in the power of stories to transcend differences, instruct, and entertain. Please welcome Maria Crooks.
Hello, everyone. Tonight, I'm going to focus my presentation on Caribbean stories, characters in those folk tales, and superstitions. Storytelling and superstitions are huge in the Caribbean culture. Storytelling, the tradition of storytelling arrived in the Caribbean directly from Africa when our forefathers or ancestors were trafficked from from Africa to the Caribbean, going back as far as the 15th century. And these people brought with them their customs, their stories, their beliefs, and these stories and beliefs and customs have been transferred from generation to generation until today. Storytelling is so important and forms such a cultural mosaic in the Caribbean that some storytellers have become icons and are venerated for their storytelling. People such as Mark Matthews of Guyana or Alfred Cragnell of Barbados, the Ricardo Keynes Douglas and his brother Paul from Grenada, and of course, the inimitable Louise Bennett Coverley, who is affectionately known as Miss Lou from Jamaica. She was revered and loved throughout the island and throughout the Caribbean as well. She was the first personality of note who chose to write and to tell her stories in local vernacular, patois, rather than in standard English. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the characters that appear in Caribbean folktales. The first one that I'm going to tell you about is Anansi. Now Anansi comes directly from West Africa, from Ghana, from the Ashanti tribe, and he's a little spider, although in some stories he also takes on human form. He's a tricky little spider who is very witty, very creative, and as they would say in Jamaica, Jinal. And Jinal means cunning. He's always playing tricks on people and getting away with it. Although sometimes he does get his own comeuppance. He is loved both as a villain and as a hero. And his stories are usually there usually is a moral to the stories about Brian Anansi, whether it is that you should not be foolish or you should pay attention to your parents and so forth. Now, in some parts of Jamaica, when you tell an Anansi story, at the end, to end the story, you say, Jack Madora, me no choose none. Now, I'm not absolutely sure what that is supposed to mean, but I think it means that I have not embellished the story in any way. The way that I heard it, this is how I am telling you. So, as Jamaicans would say in patois, as so me get it, as so me sell it. The other character that I want to tell you about, among the others that I'll be talking about tonight, is La Diablesse. And she is known in Trinidad, although she's also known in other Caribbean islands as well. She's a fusion of West African and French cultures. And as her name implies, she is the devil woman, the temptress, the seductress, who uses her wiles to entrap men who have the ill luck of meeting her late at night on the road. She is described as beautiful with ebony dark skin and tall and imposing and voluptuous. She is known to dress in clothing that bespeaks of an era, bygone era, with long voluminous skirts and a huge hat that covers half of her face. She is known to wait by lonely byways at night. And the men that come across her are so taken by her beauty and her seduction that they fail to notice that, in fact, she has one human foot and one cloven hoof. One foot is like that of a cow's. And it is said that she walks along the path with the human foot on the path, and then the cloven hoof trailing along the side of the road in the grass. And it is also said that the men who follow her up into the mountains are never seen or heard from again. Now, the next creature or the next character that I'm going to mention is the rolling calf. Now, the rolling calf used to strike terror in my little heart when I was a child. It's a nocturnal creature that is supposed to be the spirit of a dead person. As we say in Jamaica, a duppy. Ghosts are known as duppies in Jamaica. And it appears as a terrifying bull with huge horns, although apparently sometimes it can also appear as a goat. And it has huge bulging eyes that are bloodshot, and flames come from its nostrils, and it wears a huge, big iron chain around its neck. And as it goes galloping through the countryside, you hear the sound of the chain clanking and crashing through the night. Now, it is said that the only way that you can combat a rolling calf is if you have a switch made of brambles and dry sticks, and you hold it in your left hand and you hit him with this stick, and this will let him disappear. Another way to get rid of this creature is if you happen to have a mirror. And now, who doesn't have a mirror, late at night walking through the countryside? So if you happen to have a mirror, you can use that mirror and angle it in such a way that you can get the moonlight to fall on the creature. And apparently, moonlight is anathema to this creature, and it will flee and leave you alone. The next character that I want to talk about is La Sucuyante, and she also comes from Trinidad. Now, during the day, she appears as a harmless creature, a harmless old woman. But at night, at night, she sheds her wrinkled skin and becomes her true self, a ball of fire. And she goes shrieking through the night in search of human blood. And it is said that she searches for human blood among the young, because that makes her strong and gives her vim and vigor. The only way that you can combat La Sucuyante is if you have a bag of coarse salt, and you pour some in a plate and put it on the window by your windowsill or by the foot of the bed. And she is compelled to stop and count every grain of salt. And in so doing, she sometimes misses the count and she has to start all over again. And she spends the whole night counting the grains of salt, and therefore cannot attack. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about superstitions in the Caribbean. People in the Caribbean, Jamaica, Cuba, all over, are very, very, very religious. But that does not stop them from also being very superstitious. Now, I'm not saying that everybody believes all the superstitions in the world, but it's so much a part of the culture that it's like all encompassing. Everybody has something that they believe in. Now, for example, if your right eye is jumping in Jamaica, if your right eye has been jumping all day, it means that you're going to come across or see somebody that you haven't seen in a long time. So it wouldn't be unusual to hear somebody say, run into a long lost friend and say something like, me know say me not go see somebody that me never seen a long time. I was jumping all morning. On the other hand, if your left eye is jumping, it means that something bad is going to happen. So you have to keep these straight. There are a lot of superstitions around babies and children. If you pick up a newborn baby from its cot, you are supposed to fold the sheets back because to prevent a duppy, a ghost, from taking up residence in the baby's cot. If the mother of a young child or baby dies, you're supposed to pass the child over the casket twice so that the duppy does not come back to claim that child. And you're supposed to dress your baby in red to keep evil away from him. In Cuba, we have a number of, I was born in Cuba, that was where I was born, and we have a number of superstitions or beliefs or customs surrounding New Year's Eve. New Year's Eve, you're supposed to throw water outside. At the moment that 12 o'clock arrives, you're supposed to throw water outside the door and make the sign of the cross. And it's a way of getting rid of all the bad things that have happened in the past year and welcoming the new year. And my mother was, this was one of the customs that my mother would do, and that my sister and I now carry on. Now, I have to tell you that in the Caribbean, it's very easy to stand outside in December and throw water out. But doing it in Calgary, in cold Calgary, it's slightly different. And sometimes the water freezes before it actually hits the ground. Or you can create a slipping hazard, which is not a great way to start the year. Another thing, another belief that comes from Cuba is that at midnight on New Year's Eve, you're supposed to eat 12 grapes in 12 seconds and make 12 wishes, and they'll come true. In Cuba, there is a religion known as Santeria, and it's a fusion of West African religion and Catholicism. During slavery, the enslaved were not allowed to worship their gods. And so they would pretend to be worshiping or praying to a Catholic saint when in fact they were praying to their orishas, which were the deities of Santeria. And one of the beliefs of Santeria is that you're supposed to feed the gods. And I remember as a child going with my parents to visit friends, and they would they would have an altar in the living room, and they would have a painting or a picture of a Catholic saint, and in front of the saint there would be a plate of food, or a candle, or a glass of water. Now, people in Cuba, Santeria is very popular in Cuba. And it's not just people of African descent that believe in Santeria. And it is said that even Fidel Castro became a believer when in 1959 he was giving a speech to commemorate his having won the revolution. And as he was standing outdoors giving his speech, a dove landed on his shoulder. And he took it as an auspicious sign that he was going to be successful. Now, I have to say that I think that a dove landing on your shoulder is way more auspicious than having a fly land on your head. In Cuba, there is something known as mal de ojo, which means the evil eye. And people, it's interestingly enough, it's not a belief that comes from Africa. It's actually a belief that comes from Spain. And people in Cuba will wear amulets or bracelets to prevent the evil eye from attacking them. Or they'll pin little bags of garlic on their children's underwear to keep away the evil eye. And I have to say that I remember as a child that I actually used to have one of those things pinned onto my underwear to keep the evil eye away from me. I think it worked. In Cuba, if someone overstays their welcome, or if you know that somebody is coming over who is very long-winded and doesn't leave, you can put a broom behind the door, and apparently it will make them leave. And my mother told us, my sister and I, that she had done it to someone and it worked. Whether that is true or not, I take it with a grain of salt. Now, I also heard that this is true in Jamaica as well, except that in Jamaica, you're supposed to put the broom upside down and pour some salt over it, and that will get the person to leave. In Jamaica, if a husband dies, the wife is supposed to wear red underwear, as we say in Jamaica, drawers, and also to move the bed from its normal location, so that the duppy, the ghost, cannot find the bed and, you know what I mean. So, or at least I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. Now, one of the last ones that I want to tell you about is in Jamaica, if you're entering your home late at night, say after midnight, you're supposed to walk in backwards to keep the evil eye from following you into your house or into somebody else's house. So if you have any Jamaican friends and you see them walking backwards like this, entering their house, it's not that they're crazy, it's that they're just trying to stop the evil, the duffies and the ghosts from entering their house. Now, I could go on all night because they're so numerous, these stories and these superstitions. But I'll stop here. But I want to so I just want to say thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed hearing about them. And I'll suggest that if you have any plans to go to the Caribbean anytime soon, it would be a good idea to maybe take a bag of coarse salt with you in case you encounter Kasukuyong. Thank you.
Our next storyteller is Cheryl Chanyang Grayas. She is a member of the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, Saskatchewan, Treaty 6, and resides in Calgary, Treaty 7, Alberta. She has been an Indigenous activist within Calgary and area for the past decade, marching, singing, and drumming for Indigenous justice, for women, for missing and murdered women, girls, and Two-Spirit. She champions the environment and speaking up for those who cannot. Cheryl is a mother of two, Kokum, or grandmother, to two beautiful grandsons, and step Kokum to two beautiful twin granddaughters. Welcome, Cheryl. Let me just unmute you here.
Thank you, Ginger. It's an honor to be sharing airtime with these wonderful storytellers. I'm very blessed. My name is Cheryl Chanyang Grayas. I was blessed with a beautiful name in the Sweat Lodge. My Cree name is Nanantwe Esquayo Wayaku Kapimute, and I hail from Treaty 6 Muskeg Lake Cree Nations. I'm also a veteran. I joined the Air Force when I was 17 years old and achieved the rank of corporal. Really loved being in the Air Force. I enjoyed my military time. I enjoyed my military training. And I come from a strong line of military people. My dad was in the Air Force. My grandfather, my mother's dad, Joseph Grayas, was in the Army, as were his siblings. And his sister, Mary Reed Grayas, was the first Indigenous woman in the Army in Canada. I want to share a story today of someone that I admire, who is the most decorated Indigenous soldier in Canadian history, and that is Sergeant Tommy Prince. I had done research on this man, and I gathered this story that I want to share with you today. And I share it in a good way. I share it to honor not only Tommy Prince, who has left this world, but also all of our veterans, those who are still with us, and all the myriad of our spirits who have crossed over. November 11th is Remembrance Day. We wear our poppies to honor those who gave their lives, those who sacrificed so much so that we can have our freedoms, including being able to vote in a democratic society. So this is a little story about Tommy Prince. It was a cold, blustery October 25th, 1915, when Thomas George Prince was born in a canvas tent near Petersfield, Manitoba. One of 11 children born to Henry and Arabella Prince. He was grandson of Ojibwe chief William Prince of the 1884 Nile River Voyageurs and great-grandson of the mighty Chief Peguis. When his family moved to Broken Head Reserve near Canterbury, Manitoba, little warrior Prince was only 5 years old when forced to attend Elkhorn Residential School. He survived the residential school experience, and at 14, he came home with a grade 8 education. Prince's father was an expert hunter and trapper, and Prince developed exceptional skills in tracking, hunting, and marksmanship. Growing up in the bush. Wanting more, Prince joined the Army Cadets as a team, easily meeting the recruiting requirements. However, when he applied to the Canadian Army, he was rejected several times due to widespread discrimination towards Indigenous people. He kept on fighting to get into the Army and finally enlisted at age 24, June 3rd, 1940. Originally a sapper combat engineer, Prince volunteered for the parachute unit. By late 1942, he was training with an elite American unit, the Green Berets. Prince learned stealth tactics, amphibious and mountain warfare, rock climbing, hand-to-hand combat, and explosives. He became a valiant scout. Prince was well suited to the special services, using the skills he'd mastered growing up on reserve, and this versatile assault group gained a reputation for specialized reconnaissance and raiding. Tommy Prince was a true warrior spirit, an unpredictable yet entertaining brother in arms, quiet, attentive, observant. The Prince of the Brigade was both a prankster and a silent assassin. At night, he would remove his boots, slip on his moccasins, creep silently into the enemy camp as they slept. He would do crazy things like stealing the Germans' shoes right off their feet. Sometimes during the night, he and his colleagues would shoe polish their faces, creep into the German barracks, and slit the throat of every third German soldier sleeping. Come morning, the Germans would wake to find that their shoes were missing, their bunkmates were dead, totally freaking them out. Near the village of Majo, Italy, Prince snuck up to the German position and killed every man in every bunker, making the attack the next morning much easier. The Germans rightly feared the Devil's Brigade. It was a cold, blustery February day when Reconnaissance Sergeant Prince volunteered to spy on the Germans. An abandoned farmhouse 200 meters from the enemy served as his observation post. 1,400 meters of wire connected him to his brigade. With a clear view of the enemy's artillery placements, Prince reported on the German movements. Allied and German artillery fire became heavy as a result of Prince's work. During a 24-hour solo launch, Prince's communication line was cut by bombing. Donning farmer's garb, he grabbed a hoe and in full view of the German soldiers, acted like a farmer tending his crops. He slowly inched his way along the line until he found where it was damaged. He stooped to tie his shoes and fixed the wire while the German soldiers watched, oblivious to his true identity. Pretending to be disgusted with the soldiers, Prince shook his fist at the Germans and then the Allies, yelling, "Idiot dishaki! Idiot dishaki! Idiots and fools!" Something he had picked up from the locals. He returned to the farmhouse to continue his reporting. Over the next 24 hours, 4 German batteries were destroyed thanks to him. 6 months later, the Devil's Brigade headed north, entering southern France. It was a cold, blustery September day when Sergeant Prince and a private, scouting deep behind enemy lines, located a large German battalion. Coming back from their reconnaissance, the 2 men were caught in a fierce crossfire between French forces and the Germans. Prince and the private started sniping at the Germans. Taking out so many of them, they withdrew. Then the French commander asked Prince where his company was. He simply pointed to the private. The French commander was shocked to realize that it was just Prince and a private behind the forced German retreat. He thought the rapid fire was coming from at least 50 Allied soldiers. Impressed by Prince's bravery, he recommended Prince for the Croix de Guerre. Unfortunately, the courier was killed en route, and the message never reached General Charles de Gaulle. Prince returned to his unit, leading them back to the German encampment. The entire battalion of 1,000 Germans was captured. By this time, our stalwart warrior had been without food, water, and sleep for 72 hours, crossing over 70 kilometers of rugged mountainous terrain. When the fighting ended in France, Prince was summoned to Buckingham Palace to receive his medals from King George VI. It was noted that Sergeant Prince's courage and utter disregard for personal safety were an inspiration to his fellows and a marked credit to his unit. Tommy Prince was honorably discharged from the Army June 15, 1945, and returned to Canada. At home, Prince faced another war, racism from the Canadian government. Despite his wartime service, as an Indigenous man, he was not allowed to vote in federal elections, and he was refused the same benefits as other Canadian veterans. Prince briefly owned his own cleaning business, but it failed in his absence as he fought on behalf of his people. He lobbied for change, but became frustrated with the inequity and the lack of change to the racist Indian Act. Facing unemployment and discrimination, Prince re-enlisted in 1951 and served with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the PPCLI. He was second in command of a rifle platoon, serving 2 tours of duty in Korea. He returned to Canada and remained in the Army, serving at Winnipeg's Personnel Depot until honorably discharged in 1953 due to crippling arthritis in his knees. It was a hot, sweltering day in June 1955 when Prince witnessed a man drowning at the Alexander Docks in Winnipeg. Prince, ever the warrior, leapt into the fast-moving waters and saved the man. The heroic Prince, however, fell on hard times, living out his last years in a Salvation Army shelter. He died at the Deer Lodge Hospital in Winnipeg on November 25, 1977. He was only 62 years old. It was a cold, blustery day when Sergeant Thomas George Prince was buried in Winnipeg's Brookside Military Cemetery. His pallbearers were his PPCLI brothers in arms. Ojibwe men from his reserve chanted and drummed the death of a warrior honor song as he was lowered into the grave. More than 500 people attended his funeral, including Manitoba's lieutenant governor and consuls from France, Italy, and the US. All in all, Prince was awarded 11 medals for bravery, and 3 of them in Korea. He was one of only 59 Canadians awarded the Slipper Medal during the Second World War, and one of 3 also receiving the military medal, making Prince the most decorated Indigenous soldier in Canadian history. He was also the most decorated soldier in the Devil's Brigade. In 1968, Hollywood portrayed the elite unit in the movie The Devil's Brigade, with Prince's character called Chief. Tommy Prince was married with 5 children. He had a strong sense of civic duty and a fierce pride in his people. Ever the warrior, Prince dedicated himself to attaining increased educational and economic opportunities for Indigenous people. All my life, I had wanted to do something to help my people recover their good name, Tommy Prince said. I wanted to show them they were as good as any white man, he said. Perhaps even better, Sergeant Prince. Perhaps even better. Thank you. We honor our veterans. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Doreen Vanderstoop is a storyteller, musician, and writer based in Calgary, Alberta. Doreen sings, plays guitars, and performs stories of all kinds for audiences of all ages. Her debut novel, Watershed, was published by Freehand Books and has received critical acclaim. Doreen has participated in author panels at the Calgary Public Library, Victoria Festival of Authors, Word on the Street Toronto, and on the National Arts Centre's Canada Performs series. Doreen also leads workshops to inspire in others a passion for story, written and oral. It's my very honor and pleasure to introduce my good friend, Doreen Vanderstoop.
Thank you very much, Chantal, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to you and Ginger for organizing this wonderful concert tonight, and to my fellow storytellers who told such rich, beautiful stories and did it so well. I was very much struck by Maria's story, partly because my story involves superstition as well. But I was thinking, if there was ever a year that we all need to throw water out our back door and make a sign of the cross, it's 2020. So thank you for your story, Maria. It was beautiful. Dutch people are no strangers to superstition. And so this is a little story that has some superstition in it. The story, oh, is there no sound? Are you not hearing me? Oh, I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, good. So this story is called The Boy Who Wanted More Cheese, and it's from my home country of the Netherlands. Klaas van Bommel was a 12-year-old Dutch boy who lived with his family on a dairy farm in the Netherlands. He was 5 feet tall, weighed 100 pounds, and he had hair the color of carrots. It was cut level from under one ear right around to the other. Now, of course, as was the custom, he wore wooden shoes, very much like the ones I'm showing you right here. He also wore a rough blue linen shirt, and he wore woolen breeches, the pant legs of which were as wide as coffee bags. Now, they were gathered at the ankle, so when Klaas wore them, he looked like he had an upside-down cowbell on each leg. But the most striking thing about Klaas was his appetite. Now, the Van Bommel family was not rich, but they ate well. For breakfast and supper, well, Klaas would eat, fresh baked bread and creamy milk. At lunchtime, he would have a great big platter of boiled potatoes that he would dip in a bowl of melted butter. Mmm, delicious. And at every meal, there was cheese. Now, the Von Bommel pantry at any given time looked like there was enough cheese in it to feed a small army. Still, Klaas's mother always doled it out in very thin slices, which the boy considered not thick enough. At every meal, Klaas cried out, "Meer kaas, moeder, meer kaas." More cheese, mother, more cheese. Well, his father would wag his finger at him and ask if he had a well underneath his blue linen shirt. And his mother, she would shake her head and call him boter en eieren, butter and eggs. Well, that was the name of the weed that irked her so in her garden. One summer evening, after a well-deserved scolding, Klaas moped off to bed. He had teased each of his three sisters into giving him their piece of cheese. Well, their slices on top of his own made his belly feel quite full. Well, he dragged himself up those stairs all the way up to the attic because that's where his room was. Klaas wasn't feeling so well and wanted to get a little fresh air. Well, one of the dakpanne, the roof tiles, had been taken out to put in a small window. Klaas pulled over a little stool, stood up on the stool, opened that little window so he could smell some of that fresh air from the pine trees on the nearby sand dunes. As he sniffed that fresh air, well, he did start to feel a little better. When he looked out at the trees, he was surprised to see twinkling lights among them. And then the lights approached the house. And they came right up to the roof and they circled around the chimney a few times and then passed back and forth in front of Klaas's little window. Then he heard a whispered invitation. "Wij hebben veel kaas. Wij hebben veel kaas. Kom." "We have plenty of cheese. We have plenty of cheese. Come." Klaas hesitated. He had heard the wise old women of the village talk about the enchanted ladies of the woods. They warned the travelers about them. And Klaas himself had seen the fairy rings of mushrooms in the clearings in the woods that were purported to be the gateway to the fairy realm. And when you went through the gateway, sometimes you didn't come back. Again, the invitation came. "Wij hebben veel kaas. Wij hebben veel kaas." "I'll just have a look anyway," Klaas said. So he stepped down off the stool, tiptoed down the stairs, slipped into his wooden shoes, and ran to the pine trees on the sand dunes. When he arrived in a clearing, he stopped short and could not believe his eyes. His eyes opened wide as cheese wheels, for there in the clearing were dozens of the prettiest creatures he had ever seen. They were no bigger than dolls, but lively as crickets. And they were so brightly lit, well, they looked like lanterns with wings. Well, he had barely had time to recover from that surprise when the fairies encircled him, and one of them whispered in his ear, "Kom met ons dansen." Come dance with us. Before he knew it, he had a fairy hand in each of his, and he was whirling around their circle, dancing faster and faster and faster, and went on until he began to see a pink hue on the eastern horizon. Well, after a while, he was quite spent, and he fell down into the center of the fairy ring to catch his breath. That's when he realized that all the fairies were now bringing him cheese. They came from every direction, north, south, east, and west. They brought red balls from Edom, yellow and gold spheres from Gouda, and the gray loaf-shaped cheeses from Leiden. Well, all those fairies had golden knives, and all of those fairies cut chunks off those cheeses. And they fed them to class with their own hands. Oh, it was so delicious. Class thought now he would and could eat all the cheese he had ever wanted. Creamy, salty, delicious. Well, after a while, his jaws grew tired of chewing, and his stomach felt like it was full of cannonballs, and he wanted to stop. But Dutch fairies never tire, and they continued to cut off chunks of cheese, and they brought more and more cheese from every direction, so many that it piled up around class like a wall. Still, they brought more. One of the biggest and strongest of the fairies brought in a giant cheese wheel from Friesland. It was as big as a cartwheel, but she trundled it along as if she were playing with a hoop. Delicious. But again, the wall piled higher and higher. The fairies were still feeding class all the cheese, and the queen of the fairies hovered over him, saying, "Ete, ete, ete," eat, eat, eat. Well, after a while, the wall grew so tall, class felt like a frog in a well. It began to wobble, and so he screamed, thinking it was going to fall. But the Dutch fairies, well, they thought he was singing. For Dutch fairies don't know how a boy expresses himself. They brought more and more cheese. They brought cheese from Alkmaar, and then they brought the stinky cheese from Limburg that class didn't like at all. Soon the wall was so tall and it was quaking, and class knew that it was going to fall on him. He covered his eyes and waited for his demise. But nothing happened. He uncovered one eye and then the other, and he looked around. The cheese was gone. The fairies were gone. The sun was just coming up above the eastern horizon. He heard the cock crow from the Von Bommel farm, and in the distance in the village, he heard the clock chime. Well, he stood up and he felt his clothes, and there was dew on his clothes. Well, he shook himself a little and he began to walk back towards the farmhouse. Klaas never told anyone about what had happened that night, and he always wondered, did the fairies leave because the cheese tower fell or because the dawn came? Now, I would like to end with a little folk song, a little adapted folk song to go with the story. And this is a song about drie kleine kleutertjes, 3 little children who were sitting on a fence, op een hek. Now, what were they talking about? Waarover spraken zij? Well, they must have been very hungry because they were talking about stukjes kaas, pieces of cheese, as yellow as the sun, zo geel als de zon. And all of this is happening on a lovely summer day in September. 3 kleine kleutertjes die zaten op het hek, bovenop het hek. 3 kleine kleutertjes die zaten op het hek, al op een mooie zomerse dag in september. Waarover spraken zij, die 3 daar op het hek, bovenop het hek? Waarover spraken zij, die 3 daar op het hek, Al op een mooie zomerse dag in september. 'Twas over stukjes kaas zo geel als de zon, geel als de zon. 'Twas over stukjes kaas zo geel als de zon, al op een mooie zomerse dag in september. So again, I'd like to thank my fellow storytellers, Ginger, Chantal, for their organization, and to Storytellers of Canada in particular for supporting this project financially. Thank you so much. And thank you, listeners out there, for listening.
I'd like to thank all of the storytellers for sharing their rich stories with us tonight, and all the listeners for your patience as we work through some of these technical issues. As a new storytelling format, we're still getting over some of those bumps. So our storytellers have shared their personal experiences and insights, their cultural teachings, their folk heroes, and their bits of wisdom wrapped in wonderful characters. And these stories, these legends, whether they're fiction or nonfiction, they all share the technique of engagingly written words, engagingly crafted words to reveal life's truths. So before Chantal finishes the evening with a song, I'd like to share a wee story. I promise you it's very short, that speaks to the idea of truth and story. And if you want to hear any of these stories again, this concert will be kept on Storytelling Alberta's YouTube channel. Please like us, please comment, please share us, and please tell stories. And so here is the story of truth and story. You may not know this, but truth and story are sisters. Now, truth, she's the sensible sister. She always wore a plain tunic. She styled her hair in one long braid, and she didn't wear makeup. She didn't even wear jewelry. She didn't adorn herself in any way. Now, her sister, Story, was the opposite, as sisters often are, and she was absolutely flamboyant. She liked to wear long, colorful tunics that dragged behind her in the street. And she liked to wear her hair loose and wild. And she loved to adorn herself. She called her eyes and she rouged her lips. And she wore long earrings, and oh, how she loved bangles. She would wear them all the way up her arms so that you could hear Sister Story walking long before you could see her. And when people heard that wonderful jangling of her bangles, all work stopped. And people looked and watched with wonder as she walked down the street. Oh, so elegant, so regal. And the children would gather at her feet and say, "Tell us what you know." And she would. Sometimes it was a story of magic or a description of a delightful feast. It was whatever she felt like talking about that day. And she would carry on her way, and people would watch, and they would not start working again until they could no longer hear her. Now, Truth, she also wanted people to hear her, to listen to her. But she didn't wear those bangles, so they couldn't hear her. And well, she wore that simple tunic, and she kind of blended into the background a little bit. And she would yell out, "Listen to me, I have something important to say." But people were not interested. They just kept working. And so one day, Truth decided to do what many sisters do. She decided to borrow a couple of items from Sister Story's wardrobe. And the next time that Sister Truth went out, why, people could hear her long before they could see her. And when they finally saw her, they could see her rich robes dragging behind her, those colorful tunics. And well, they could see her cauled eyes and her rouged lips and her crazy hair. And they gathered around her feet, those children did, and they said, "Tell us what you know." And well, she did. And she rather liked that feeling of being listened to. And so Truth decided not to return those items to her sister. And from that day to this, that is why we cannot tell the difference between Sister Truth and Sister Story. Thanks for listening.
Hi, and thanks everyone for joining us today. This is the traveling song. Hi, I'm a Gwitch, and happy National Storytelling Day, everyone. Have a wonderful week. Thank you for joining us today for the Legends We Share. Presented by Storytelling Alberta, connecting through story. Sponsored by the Ontario Arts Council, Storytellers of Canada, Canada Council for the Arts, and the Alberta Foundation for the Arts. Thank you to our sponsors and our generous donors, to our wonderful storytellers, and to all of you, for it's the legends we share that connect us.